magazine, How to Death-Proof a City, and she's also author of a new book, Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And now live coverage of the House as they take up the spending bill for the Homeland Security Department's 2014 spending.
List submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I recently returned from a trip to Bangladesh where more than 1,100 garment workers died and 2,000 were injured in the Rana Plaza building collapse on April 24th. Many Americans may remember the horrible pictures of workers being buried under tons of concrete from the collapsed building. I learned a great deal about what must be done to improve safety conditions in the garment industry there. Bangladesh is the second largest garment producing nation, employing over 4 million skilled and industrious workers, mostly women, at a minimum wage of $37 a month. I learned that many factories continue to operate in unsafe residential or multi-story commercial buildings even after the Rana Plaza building collapse. I learned more about poor conditions created by a myriad of middlemen hired by retailers to pit one factory against the neck, squeezing out the last few pennies per garment. I learned that Bangladesh garment workers subsidize those low prices with their lives. I visited the hospital where scores of women, many with amputated legs and arms, were suffering from brain damage from the collapse of that building where they were working and where they were locked inside. I met with the woman near Rana Plaza who was looking for her son, even though the unidentifiable or the unclaimed workers had been buried in a mass grave. And Rana Plaza is not an isolated case. I visited with 7 courageous women injured in the Tarzine Fashions factory fire that killed 112 workers last September. 7 women who had to jump from the 3rd and 4th floors of their factory because the factory supervisors locked the exits after the fire had started and told them to go back to work or they would be fired, and the doors were locked. That was the policy of that factory and many other factories, and just this week we saw poultry workers in China locked in the factory after the fire had started, and they too perished in the fire. 7 women who had to make the decision to jump from the 3rd and 4th floors of this factory to save their lives. Kazreen produced garments for Walmart and many other American brands. Listen to what the women told me. Rahana jumped from the 4th floor window and was knocked unconscious. She broke her leg, and doctors have told her she will need to be on crutches the rest of her life. Reba was a breadwinner in her home. She jumped from the 3rd floor. She cannot work because of the pain. Her husband is sick. She has 2 sons, one who just qualified for the military college, but she doesn't know if she can afford to keep him there. And until I prodded the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Export Association, Reba had not received the promised stipend for those who were injured 6 months later. Roshahana jumped from the 3rd floor and still has severe pain in her back and legs. She was visibly in pain and was sitting too long talking to us. She is single and gets by on loans. She has 2 teenage sons in school and doesn't want to force them to go to work, but she worries how she'll get by. Deepa worked on the 3rd floor. She saw the fire and tried to escape to the 2nd floor. The factory manager padlocked the door and told everyone to keep working. Workers were crying and searching for a way out. The mechanic yelled to come to the east side of the building where he had created an exit. She jumped from the 3rd floor and fell unconscious. She broke her left leg and was 4 months pregnant, and she lost her baby. Sumi decided to jump from the 3rd floor rather than perish in the factory because she wanted her family to be able to identify her body, and that wouldn't happen if she was consumed in the fire. She broke her leg and arm and could not move. Her family borrowed money to pay for her medical bills before the association funds arrived. 2 weeks before the Rana Plaza, she came to the U.S. to urge retailers and brands to join the enforceable and binding accord on fire and building safety. Nazma said she would have died if she waited 10 more minutes to jump. She saw the manager locking the gate to the second set of stairs and grabbed him by the collar to stop him, but he ignored her. She cut her arms trying to get through the window to reach the bamboo scaffolding. She broke her backbone. She can't carry anything or do housework. And she has 3 children. Her stipend went to medical care and to her children's education. Her 14-year-old son has had to leave school and try to find work. I'm grateful that these women had the courage to tell me their stories. There is widespread agreement that the Tazreen fire and the Rana Plaza collapse, workers had a right to, if none of this would have happened, if they had had the right to refuse unsafe work, they would be alive today. Not the factory. Nobody denied that that's the case. But for too long, Bangladesh government has blocked new unions. Only now, facing the potential loss of trade preferences, the government has opened the door a crack. 27 new unions have been registered recently, reversing the trend where only 1 union per year was registered, and there are 5,000 factories. I met the leaders of some of these newly formed unions, young and serious workers, but only time will tell if the government lives up to its promise of the union rights. In addition, the Obama administration will soon conclude its review of Bangladesh's trade preferences under the generalized system of preferences. And in my view, these preferences should be suspended. The one message I have for the Americans holdouts who won't agree to these safety accords is listen to the women from Bangladesh.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, across this country there are great men and women who answer the call to serve their communities. These folks are blessed with remarkable talents and success, and who share their success with their communities to improve the places that we all call home. In North Carolina's 13th district, that man was Dale Bone. Dale was a man who exemplified the character, commitment, and charity of our district, and who left behind a legacy of improving all things that he touched. Born and raised in rural Nash County, Dale was a proud graduate of NC State University with degrees in agronomy and agricultural economy. And after several years farming in his home community, Dale founded Nash Produce in 1977 and within a decade had grown it into the largest cucumber producer in the country. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Bone, a man of constant and restless energy, he served on countless state and national boards, committees, and commissions, including his service as president of the National Council of Agricultural Employers. Dale also delved into his local community with characteristic resolve. He served as a trustee for Barton College and as a board member for the Salvation Army and on the Arts Council of Wilson, North Carolina. In addition to all his honors and activism, Dale was also able to make a direct personal impact in the lives of his employees and their children. Dale cared deeply for the well-being of all his employees, many of whom were migrant workers, by providing them with financial support necessary for them to learn English and attend the local community college. Dale and his beloved wife, Genia, also committed to improving the lives of local children. Dale and Jenny endowed the Bone Scholarship Program at NC State University, which continues to offer significant scholarships to the children of migrant workers. And in his later years, Mr. Speaker, Dale was particularly proud of the involvement he and his wife had in creating and promoting the Wilson Youth United, which offers direction and guidance to help local youths in the community. Dale was a man of great ability and, as a result, great means. He recognized the fact that our country is only as strong as its communities and that the best solutions to our problems usually come from the most local sources. Across the nation, members of the agriculture community send thanks to Dale for his decades of untiring work on their behalf. In equal measure, Dale educated and prepared those around him to face the challenges of their future. Dale was in all things a humble man, but I do believe that he would take great pride in the legacy that he leaves behind. Mr. Speaker, America was built by people like Dale Bone, and it's that spirit, not what we do here in Washington, that will rebuild our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker,
This is my 13th End Hunger Now speech this year. 13 times I've stood on this floor and talked about hunger in America. 13 times I've come here and defended the anti-hunger safety net, the federal programs that provide food to 50 million Americans. 13 times I've stood here and talked about hunger as a health issue. 13 times I've said we need to set a goal to end hunger now. People ask me all the time, is it even possible to end hunger in America? Mr. Speaker, the answer is a definitive yes. The truth is we've done this before. That's right, Mr. Speaker. We nearly eradicated hunger in America in the 1970s. It wasn't easy, but the concept was simple. The political leadership in Washington made a commitment to end hunger in this country. In the 1970s, Congress and the President expanded the food stamp program, created the WIC program, and expanded the school meal programs. They found the political courage to do what's right because they believed that it was unacceptable that anyone in America went hungry. Yet that effort was lost when these programs were slashed in the 1980s. Hunger came back with a vengeance. The number of hungry people skyrocketed. In fact, it's been rising steadily since the Reagan presidency. These programs weren't just cut, they were demonized. Food assistance became a pejorative to some, and we see the results of those years of demonizing these programs today. The truth is, SNAP works. Food assistance works. People on food assistance are able to feed themselves and their families. They're able to use money they might have had to use for food for other purposes like rent, utilities, medical costs, school supplies for their kids, and transportation costs, just to name a few, in order to be able to buy nutritious food. They didn't have to make the choice between food or rent. But that's not all. The money spent on food from these programs is spent on food which is produced by our farmers. It is spent in grocery stores. In fact, a recent report showed that approximately $70 billion was spent in grocery stores just from SNAP alone during our economic downturn. That's a lot of money going through our economy when our economy was damaged and needed the help. These programs work, Mr. Speaker, but what's the response from the Republican-controlled House? Are they strengthening a program that is already among the least fraudulent, most efficient and effective in terms of our federal government? No. In 2 weeks, this House will consider a farm bill that will cut $20.5 billion from SNAP. It will take food away from 2 million Americans. It is a bill that will take 210,000 poor kids off of free school meal programs. It is a bill that will reduce the monthly SNAP benefit by $90 for another 850,000 people. And that's on top of the automatic across-the-board cuts to SNAP that will take place in November, even if we cut nothing else. That's not only wrong, it is quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, beneath this great country of ours. And I will fight these cuts, and I urge all my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, to stand with me in pushing back on these cuts. We should be praising this program for keeping people from starving. We should be strengthening it and making it work better, not neutering it and taking food away from millions of poor families. SNAP works, but don't take my word for it. Listen to the words of Trish Thomas Henley, someone who had to rely on SNAP to make ends meet. And she says, and I quote, "In 1993, I was a single parent with a 3-year-old and an 18-month-old. Even though I was working full-time, making $8.50 an hour as an administrative assistant, I could not afford to pay for food, housing, and daycare. I went on food stamps. I remember the shame I felt every time I stood at the register while other shoppers waited for me to count out my food stamps. The only way out of the cycle of poverty and off of aid was to go to college. I applied and at the age of 25 began my undergraduate career. I had to give up my full-time job to go to school. Instead, I worked 3 part-time jobs. I would never, ever have been able to get through school without food stamps, Pell Grants, and student loans. It took a village and government aid. I was not a victim. I did not feel entitled. I then as now, felt immensely grateful that I lived at a moment when my government chose to invest in me. It has been a smart investment, and I am grateful that because of this investment, I am now able to contribute and live up to my full potential." End of quote. Today, Trish is a professor at the University of Cincinnati. You see, Mr. Speaker, a little investment goes a long way, and I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record at the end of my remarks the column written by Trish entitled "Food Stamps Do Work." SNAP works. It worked in the 1970s as the food stamp program. It worked for Trish in the 1990s, and it's working now. This is not the time to cut SNAP. We should be strengthening the ladders of opportunity that help people succeed. We should, with the help of the White House, develop a plan to end hunger now. We should not be supporting a farm bill that will make hunger worse. Now is the time to renew our efforts and pledge to end hunger now. I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to commend the House leadership for its continuing commitment to restore the open appropriations process of the House. That process is absolutely essential if the House is to meet its constitutional responsibility to superintend the nation's finances. It assures that the people's elected representatives can provide the maximum scrutiny of every public expenditure. In the recent past, this process has given way to continuing resolutions that simply rubber stamp past federal spending, thus abrogating Congress's most fundamental fiscal responsibility. For this reason, I, for one, will not support any continuing resolutions of this nature. The regular order over the nation's finances must be reasserted, and the open appropriations process that has begun in the House this week does so. That process, though, is the final step in the procedures established to assure that our nation's spending gets careful examination. The first step in that process, and the most important step, is when programs are authorized or reauthorized. Legislation must first be adopted that establishes the programs for which money is subsequently appropriated. That is an absolutely critical function that assures federal programs are constantly being scrutinized and that Congress is asking, are these programs effective? Are they meeting their goals? Are they worthwhile? Are they worth the money we're paying? Most programs have time limits on them to assure that these questions are periodically asked. The legal authorization, then, is the green light to the Appropriations Committee to provide funding for that program. And for that reason, since 1835, the rules of the House have limited appropriations to only those purposes actually authorized by law. Unless and until the program is authorized, the House may not appropriate funds for it under this long-standing rule. And yet this rule is routinely ignored by the Appropriations Committee and by the House. Last year, the appropriations bills reported out of the committee contained over $350 billion for programs that had either never been authorized or whose authorizations had lapsed years and sometimes decades ago. Many of these are vital programs whose reauthorization should be routine, but many are not. For example, the Community Development Block Grant Program that paid for a doggy daycare center in Ohio and a day at the circus for Nyack, New York, lapsed 18 years ago, and yet every year we keep funding it lavishly. Most of the outrageous wastes of taxpayer money that end up in various pork reports stem from these lapsed programs. They're established, then they're forgotten, but the spending keeps on year after year. The excuse for this conduct is that the authorizing committees have simply failed to attend to their duties of keeping authorizations current, including for a number of critical functions, so the Appropriations Committee takes it upon itself to fund them. Well, what's to prevent this? The House rules allow any member the right to raise a point of order against any unauthorized expenditure. But this right is stripped from members every time an appropriations bill is sent to the House floor, making this rule meaningless and unenforceable. And it's now reached the point that more than one-third of the discretionary spending approved by the House is for purposes not authorized by law. This fact makes a mockery of the leadership's efforts to restore regular order to the appropriations process. I urge the Speaker of the House to direct the authorizing committees to bring the authorizations current for every program within their respective jurisdictions and to give them a year to do so. And if, after a full year, the authorizing committees don't believe the programs are worth the time to review, well, then maybe that's just nature's way of warning us that they're also not worth the money that we continue to shovel at them. And once the committees have had that year to review these unauthorized programs and to either renew them, reform them, or let them die, I urge the House to restore the right of every member to challenge unauthorized appropriations on the floor as our rules clearly envision and provide. Americans elected a House Republican majority with one clear mandate: stop wasting our money. To be worthy of that trust, we can't allow hundreds of billions of dollars to bypass the minimal congressional review that the authorizing process provides. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNeary, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to bring attention to a recent University of California at Davis study on some effects that climate change will have in California. This report looks at habitat and temperature sensitivities for fish species within the state. California has a diverse and robust ecosystem, as well as the largest estuary in the Western Hemisphere, namely the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. The Delta and its tributaries are home to an amazing variety of native species that must be protected. The study found that of 121 native fish species in California, more than 80% will be critically endangered as a result of climate change. At the same time, non-native or invasive species will survive at a much higher rate. We must take action now to address climate change, which is starting to affect every aspect of our daily lives, including our water quality, flood risk, more severe weather, including hurricanes, tornadoes, and droughts, and the extinction of native species. The destruction posed by climate change to the natural resources we depend on for our daily sustenance is too great. Global warming is here, it's dangerous, and we need to take action now. The longer we wait, the more difficult and costly the fixes will be, and the more our fellow human beings across the world will suffer. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Black, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, in wake of this recent IRS scandal, President Obama made this promise to the American people, quote, "I'll do everything in my power to make sure nothing like this happens again," end quote. Everything? Well, what about Obamacare? In spite of the culture of corruption and cover-up at the IRS, the Obama administration is moving full steam ahead with Obamacare, a law that gives unprecedented new access and powers to unelected government bureaucrats at the IRS and several major government agencies. Consider the potential for abuses with Obamacare's mystery Federal Data Services Hub, the largest personal information database the government has ever attempted, according to the Wall Street Journal. This data hub will function like a web portal where your personal health insurance, tax and financial information, criminal background, and immigration status will be shared and transmitted between agencies including the IRS, HHS, DOJ, DHS, and SSA. While far too many questions still remain about who will have access to what information in the hub, we do know that a woman in charge of the IRS's 8 newly created Obama enforcement offices is none other than Sarah Hall Ingram, the former commissioner of the office responsible for tax-exempt organizations during the targeted IRS scandal. While the Americans who do not purchase government-approved insurance soon will find themselves targeted and harassed through IRS audits. Right now, only time will tell. With so much personal information going in and out of the hub likely privy to both government employees and contractors, many of whom will have discretion over health care coverage and tax penalties, the potential for abuses is staggering. That's why I have introduced H.R. 2022, the Stopping Government Abuses of Taxpayer Information. My bill would require not only the IRS, but all government agencies with access to Obamacare's Federal Data Services Hub to present to Congress under the penalty of perjury certification that the American people's personal information has not and will not be used for targeting any individual or group based on their beliefs. With full implementation of Obamacare only months away, the IRS scandal underscores while we must not only continue fighting to repeal the health care law, but we also have the responsibility to demand safeguards, accountability, and oversight measures to be put in place to shield Americans from further targeting and misuse of their personal information. The question is, will the President honor his promise to the American people and to do everything in his power to ensure that nothing like the IRS scandal happens again? Mr. President, join me in supporting my bill, H.R. 2022, to ensure safeguard of the American people's most personal information. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. KILDEE, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, ensuring students can afford college is vital to ensuring our nation's competitiveness in a global economy. A majority of new jobs in the next decade will require a college degree, which makes higher education an economic necessity for most Americans. Ensuring all students have the opportunity to go to college will strengthen our economy and grow our middle class and invest in our future. Yet education costs continue to rise, year after year, pricing some people out of an education. College costs have dramatically increased. Over the last decade, the cost of attending a four-year institution has increased 66% over the rate of inflation. For two-year institutions, tuition fees for students have increased 47% beyond the rate of inflation. According to the College Board, the annual cost of attending an in-state public college is now well over $22,000 a year. These rapidly rising costs are pricing hard-working families and students out of an education. Congress can and must act to ensure college remains affordable for hard-working families. And there are things we can do to do just that. First, Congress must act immediately to prevent student loan interest rates from doubling on July 1st. I've supported the Student Loan Relief Act, which would extend the current student loan interest rate 3.4% until 2015. Unfortunately, the Republican plan passed last week, the Making College More Expensive Act, would put college out of reach for many of my constituents and students across this country. I oppose the Republican plan, which would create a variable loan interest rate system, letting student loan rates spike, forcing students to pay higher interest rates. I continue to believe that students deserve the certainty of a fixed student loan interest rate. An ever-changing rate, as the Republican plan would provide, would create more anxiety and uncertainty for millions of families, and that's just the wrong approach. Hardworking students and parents have already been saddled with $1 trillion of student loan debt. Congress should be working to ease that burden. It's time that Congress return to regular order and prevent student interest rates from doubling at the end of the month. That means doing what we were sent here to do, going to conference to work out the differences between the House-passed version and the expected Senate version of this bill. The clock is ticking, and rates for millions of students will double on July 1 if we don't act. Congress shouldn't let rigid partisanship get in the way of preventing what equates to a massive tax hike on students and their families. Instead, let's do our job and legislate. Disagreements on parts of a bill is not an excuse for delay. Second, We should enact legislation to allow families to save more for college. Recently, I introduced a bill with my Republican colleague, Congressman Tim Walberg, giving greater flexibility to families to save money for tuition, books, and other educational expenses. This bill, the Helping Families Save for Education Act, would increase existing caps on Coverdell savings accounts and allow families to contribute more over longer periods of time. These types of accounts offer families a tax-advantaged choice to save for a child's educational expenses. Currently, families or beneficiaries can contribute a maximum of $2,000 a year. Our legislation would increase the maximum contribution annually for most working families. Families and students under our legislation would also be able to save for college for an additional 4 years until the student turns 22 years old. Third, we must continue to provide and fully support Pell Grants, which provides needs-based grants to low-income students. No one who wants to go to college should be priced out of doing so. So I, along with my Democratic colleagues, stand ready and eager to ensure a college degree remains in reach for every student, no matter what their means. Finally, we must keep the cost of attending college low by continuing direct state and federal support to universities. In my home state of Michigan, we are blessed with great public institutions that provide a world-class education to our citizens. Unfortunately, though, in recent years we've seen direct financial support to these universities slashed. Such cuts are then passed on to students and families. If investing in education remains a priority for this nation, we must invest in college for our students. I ask a simple question: what's more important than the education of our children? I yield back the remainder of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to address a situation that is evolving within this nation where older adults on Medicare who have the misfortune of experiencing disease or disability and require durable medical equipment that is designed to allow people to live with dignity and independence in their own homes, we're seeing through the actions of CMS, through Medicare, preventing their access with Medicare is awarding contracts to companies who are not even licensed in states to do business. In the end, it's going to cause a terrible disconnect with people being able to access the equipment that they need. And not just the equipment. I spent 30 years working in rehabilitation services as a therapist, rehab manager, and as a licensed nursing home administrator. I saw what difference this equipment makes, but also what the service makes, the technical assistance means for people who are living home on oxygen or using wheelchairs or other types of medical equipment. In the evenings, I actually was a volunteer EMT and firefighter. And frequently I'd find myself in the middle of the night, pager would go off, and I'd be out in my community, neighbor's home, and be able to witness firsthand how important that equipment is there. Well, this week, the National Association for the Support of Long-Term Care and its members are in Washington to represent ancillary providers of products and services in the post-acute care industry. Now, as part of this work, these individuals will be garnering signatures on a letter that calls on CMS, the Medicare administrator, Tavener, to delay implementation of the widely criticized durable medical equipment, prosthetics, orthotics, and supplies competitive bidding program. Now, this competitive bidding program, and believe me, it was misnamed when it was passed, there was nothing competitive about it, was intended to reduce Medicare costs and ensure that beneficiaries have access to quality services. In practice, the system denies competition while worsening access to quality goods and services and harming seniors. In many ways, their mission today in Washington reminds me of one of my favorite movies and a historic piece of our history in this country, Apollo 13 mission. The story of Apollo 13 is that it could have been the worst space disaster in history, but became one of NASA's most spectacular conquests. Everything had gone wrong. An oxygen tank had exploded in the service module, damaged the nearby oxygen tank, and rocked the command and lunar modules. Mission controllers struggled to isolate the problems with no success. The missions and the astronaut lives were in jeopardy. To conserve power, the astronauts had shut all of the spacecraft systems down except the radio. The carbon dioxide rose to toxic levels, and crew members managed for 6 days with hardly any food, water, or sleep in freezing temperatures. There was clear danger when the astronauts might not survive, but they did. Apollo 13 flight director Gene Kranz famously rallies his team to do what is necessary to get the astronauts home safely, declaring, "Failure is not an option." One of NASA's greatest achievements have become not the next feat in space exploration, but the brilliant rescue of crew members aboard Apollo 13. Similar when it comes to competitive bidding, failure is not an option. CMS competitive bidding is our damaged spacecraft. Individuals in need of durable medical equipment for prosthetics or orthotics or the flight crew. They are in danger. We need competent technical support professionals working together to achieve our mission and bring this crew home safely. After years of bureaucratic delay and mismanagement, we're no closer to a system that works for both providers and beneficiaries. That would be the seniors of our nations. Now, it appears providers are being awarded contracts by CMS to provide services for round 2 competitive bidding that lack the required licensing or accreditation for specific states in which they're supposed to service those seniors. I'm extremely concerned that mishandling of the bidding process is going to have a devastating impact on beneficiaries. This is a serious issue that warrants a full review of the process and a delay of, of round 2 until this fatally flawed program is fixed. For this reason, I encourage my colleagues to sign on to this letter to Administrator Tavener requesting a delay through the end of the year so that we can have more time to review how round 1 was implemented and fix the problems that exist with the administration of the program. I'm proud to say that as of today we have 129 signatures from members of the House of Representatives, and I encourage my colleagues who have not taken the opportunity to sign on to the letter to do so today. We need to replace this fatally flawed program with one that's not just labeled competitive, but is competitive and maintains beneficiary access to durable medical products and quality services. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a major piece of legislation again being considered by this Congress, the Farm Bill. It expired in the last Congress, and due to significant political machinations and controversies, we couldn't get it across the finish line because it was too expensive, didn't have enough reform, shortchanged nutrition, and frankly didn't deal with the conservation elements that Americans care about. But we're at it again. And the big contentious issues remain. The direct payments appear to be gone, subsidies that go to farmers regardless of whether or not they even farm the land. But the big contentious issues remain. The issues of subsidization have simply migrated. There's an effort to have a shallow loss provision or additional crop insurance subsidies that may actually end up being far more expensive than the direct payments they're supposed to be replacing. There is an ongoing controversy regarding nutrition. The Senate bill cuts $4 billion at a time when too many Americans are, in fact, food insecure, and food stamps, the SNAP program, plays a vital interest in communities around the country. The House bill is even worse, $16 billion of cuts that families rely upon and, frankly, that provide $1.70 of economic activity for each dollar that is given to beneficiaries. Well, there is one area that shouldn't be unduly controversial: the conservation titles of the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is the most important piece of environmental legislation that will be considered by this Congress. The question is whether it will be a good environmental bill or a poor one. The conservation title deals with programs that are very, very important, but that the private market doesn't provide a market-based incentive for people to invest in. I'm talking about things that, if you ask the public generally, Of course they are concerned about clean air, clean water, soil protection, wetland and grassland preservation. But these are things that we've seen for the last 60 years, unless the federal government steps in with either subsidy or regulation, we pay a terrible price, dating back to the monstrous soil erosion that was part of the Dust Bowl tragedy. Well, here again, we're in a situation where the conservation titles are in the crosshairs. It's the conservation programs that too often have been cut when we are in need of money. They are touted when people are encouraged to vote for the bill, and then those resources dissipate. They are diverted to large projects, large confined animal feedlot operations, or take huge amounts of this money to deal with something that should be part of their cost of doing business, and large operations that could fund it themselves, and takes away resources from small and medium-sized farmers, or draining valuable wetlands. There's a reason why only 1 in 4 of the application for conservation programs are approved, because there isn't enough money and too much is diverted. I've introduced H.R. 1890, the Balancing Food, Farms, and Environmental Act, that seeks to change those priorities, to be able to have more money available, targeted towards small and medium-sized farmers and ranchers, be able to put a premium on longer-term conservation. I mean, we have a bizarre situation now where, because of the amazingly bloated and inefficient farm crop insurance program, people are plowing up land that previously had been in conservation, that's going to be eroded, that's probably going to fail because it's marginal cropland, but they don't care because the federal government's going to pay them anyway, and the taxpayer loses twice. They pay through unnecessary crop insurance subsidies, and they pay because they lose the water quality, the water quantity, the protection for wildlife habitat, and soil erosion. By all means, let's have the political tug-of-war over unnecessary subsidization in terms of fighting nutrition, but let's come together on the conservation items, which really ought to be nonpartisan, focused, and economically productive. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent for advisement.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in a few days, China's new president, Xi Jinping, will conclude a tour of the Western Hemisphere by meeting with President Obama in an informal summit in California. The leaders of the Pacific Rim's 2 most powerful countries will discuss many issues of mutual concern. This important relationship, which continues to evolve dynamically, in spite of the difficulties that we both have, it springs from some radically different philosophical outlooks on both life as well as governance, and these differences deserve both our attention and candor. Mr. Speaker, it was 24 years ago this week, June 3rd, 1989. There was a massacre in China in a place called Tiananmen Square. Student protesters who were seeking some form of liberty for their interest gathered there. And I remember very vividly 2 very stark images from that time. One was the homemade replica of the Statue of Liberty that was erected in their midst. The other was a courageous Chinese man who decided to take it upon himself to stand as a silent witness, arms at his side, like a soldier at attention for the cause of human rights. He stood in the street and blocked 4 tanks as they proceeded on toward the student protesters. The tanks tried to make their way around him, and as they did, he would move and stand in front of them. Clearly, there was a dilemma going on in the minds of the young Chinese soldiers who were driving those tanks. Perhaps they didn't want to kill one of their countrymen, so they tried to avoid it. But the other young man persisted, and for a time he blocked those tanks, courageously and alone, from carrying out part of what would become the Tiananmen Square massacre. Eventually, some of his friends or some other Chinese citizens whisked him away from certain death. Those were two very stark images in my mind that have stayed with me ever since. But this week, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, another one of those student leaders actually spoke. Her name is Chai Ling. She's a courageous new American, one who knows well the tragedy of forced repression, both political repression, but also the painful silent repression in China that is not spoken of enough. It's that country's forced abortion policies, its one-child policies, which has, by the way, disproportionately targeted little unborn girls. In her testimony, she spoke clearly about her passion for China and her love for China, and her hope that the United States and China can begin a new embrace in a spirit of cooperation rooted in the fundamental respect for human dignity, which transcends both language and culture. She argues that the fear that led to the devastating persecutions of the Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen Square, and more recently this genocidal one-child policy, which has seriously distorted China's demographic balance. She said that these problems must be transformed by truth. She echoes the spirit of Qin Gaocheng, the blind Chinese activist who stood up so courageously against repression last year in China. When he visited here in Washington, he said this to us, a small group of us. He said, quote, "The intrinsic kindness of persons cannot be defeated by violence and force." Mr. Speaker, dysfunction in this important bilateral relationship between the United States and China serves neither of our countries, nor the broader world, as the influence of this relationship extends far beyond our respective national borders. China wants our markets. We want their stuff. And perversely, there are incentives for our businesses to seek out their low-cost manufacturing. We want their investment. They want our resources. We sell our enterprises. We also run up our debt. They buy the debt. And in turn, we run down our economy in an endless chase for near-term gain. This feeds a dysfunctional interdependence that is further aggravated by fundamental disagreements stemming from different worldviews and perspectives on the individual and the state. We need to look closely at our notions of self-interest in this relationship, which vividly illustrates the challenges of globalization. But there are also opportunities we could grasp, Mr. Speaker. The President recently changed the way in which we talk about the concept of national interest in his State of the Union address. And I agree with him. We should talk about our national conscience in concert with our national interest. The two are inseparable. In conscience, we cannot say that all is well with the U.S.-China relationship. We can hope for a better day, and hopefully this meeting between the President and the new President of China will bear lasting fruit, which transcends discussions about defense and economics and to that which is fundamentally just and good for all peoples of the world. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
The House returns at noon Eastern to begin work on the 2014 Homeland Security Spending Bill, the second of 12 such bills to fund the government next year. Yesterday they passed the Military Construction Veterans Affairs Bill. Homeland Security, the $47 billion measure, including $5.6 billion for emergency disaster relief. It increases funding by 7% for Customs and Border Protection. Debate and votes expected into the evening. We'll have live coverage of the House when they return here on C-SPAN. On Capitol Hill today, the House Armed Services Committee is marking up a bill